series this year. This series is sponsored by the Initiative for Individuals with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, which is a new initiative. This is only our second year in the initiative, and the goals of the initiative are eventually we hope to support graduate students who are specifically going to be working with and studying these children. We also would like to support research into topics that families care about, their children. And we also want to do this. We want to educate our community, the SBU community and larger community, about issues related to individuals with disabilities, and serve as a catalyst of discussions. We've had some very good discussions here. Welcome. Tonight we are very pleased to have Dr. Tracy Jirikowic. Yes. Thank you. Dr. Jirikowic earned her PhD in special education and rehabilitation medicine at the University of Washington. Her dissertation was on sensory processing and creation issues, and she's currently an assistant professor in the Department of Rehabilitation Medicine at the University of Washington. And since 1995, she's served as an occupational therapist and clinical specialist at the Fetal Alcohol Syndrome Diagnostic Prevention Network at the University of Washington. We're very pleased to have her today. Oh, there are sign-up sheets, I'm sorry, because you're going around. If you want to sign up for emails about future speakers.
So thank you very much. I just want to say that I appreciate the invitation to be here, and I'm very pleased to see all of you. Before we get started, I'm just curious who you all represent. I would like to know how many of you are students. I'm guessing that is around the set. There's a few of you over here. And then are there parents here? A lot of parents? Okay, and teachers or other professionals from the community? Okay, excellent. Okay, that helps. I expected a diverse audience, different backgrounds, so I'm hoping that I cover all of my objectives to meet all your diverse needs. So what I hope to accomplish today, this evening, is to provide you with an overview of sensory processing and sensory integration. So really, sensation is really important in development, and it affects our daily lives, even in adulthood. And so we're going to talk about that. It's often an overlooked aspect of who we are and how it affects behavior. And then I'm going to talk about symptoms associated with sensory processing disorders, also known as sensory integration dysfunction. So what happens when the sensory systems just aren't working as well as they should, and how does that impact children's behavior and children's development? And the last thing I'd like to do is I want to familiarize you with the different kind of intervention approaches. Again, we don't have the time, and we don't have, it's beyond the scope of this evening to really talk about specific kinds of interventions, but I want to give you sort of a taste as consumers or as people who might be going out and practicing, what's going on, what kind of things are we doing to treat these problems. And I'd also like to say that I'm coming from the perspective of an occupational therapist and a clinician, and also a researcher. So I was a clinician first and then became a researcher because a lot of what I was doing, especially around sensory integration intervention, I had a lot of questions. So I'm pleased to be in that position right now to be answering some of those questions and to be thinking about this not only from a clinical perspective, but also how we can grow the knowledge base. So what is sensory processing? So I'm going to offer you some definitions from a clinical perspective. Again, depending on who you talk to, if you talk to a neuroscientist perhaps, they might define sensory processing or sensory integration a little differently, but I'm just going to define it the best I can. And I'll also say that as our knowledge and our application of this theory and understanding of sensory processing problems evolves, the terminology evolves too. So again, I'm going to do the best we can with what we have now, because there are still, different terms floating around out there. So I'll do my best to be clear. So what is sensory processing from a clinical perspective, from the perspective of an occupational therapy practitioner, for example? It's really the brain's ability to efficiently receive, so take in information, organize, interpret, and use information from all of the sensory systems, and generate it to complete an adaptive behavioral response. So basically an adaptive behavioral response is a behavior that matches the demands of the situation that you're in. And so sensory processing, efficient sensory processing and efficient sensory integration, it really underlies our ability to cope with and manage some of the automatic behaviors in response to stimuli and changes in the environment. And we consider it a sensory motor foundation that supports higher level learning and adaptive, cognitive, and social function. So an example of that would be, again, just to bring forth sort of a lot of what the brain does automatically and what a lot of us don't really have to think about. If we just pause for a moment and we just tune into some of the sensation that you might be experiencing. Okay, so I'm going to just have you, I'll be quiet, okay, and just think about what you might see, some things you hear, what you're feeling, what your body's feeling, and be quiet so you can do that. So what are some of the sensations that you might have been experiencing? I'll make this a little interactive, and I should say that I'll welcome questions throughout the presentation. We'll definitely have time after, but as things come up, I'd like you to feel free to ask questions. Anybody want to comment?
I feel greasy because I got too much hand lotion.
Okay.
That's great.
Okay.
Greasy.
And good. Something from her sense of touch, a little bit from her hands. Hand lotion. Okay. Cold. So temperature. You were feeling temperature.
There's different sounds in the room, like the audio equipment bells and people shifting in their chairs, the noise that's different qualities of sound.
Okay. Yeah. Different background noise. And one more.
Fluorescent lights.
Okay, the light. So, so what sensory processing and sensory integration helps us do is to, in this situation, hopefully what is adaptive is your learning and your readiness to listen to me so that you're going to walk away with some useful information. And so your brains sort of automatically filter out what's not important. So you're typically, you might be just hearing but ignoring some of these sounds from the projector and some of the shuffling around. Some of you might be getting used to the lights, and there's also a lot of sensation coming. Perhaps from the clothes you're wearing, you can feel that, or from the chair you're sitting on. And most of the time, again, you don't really need to pay attention to that. Your body just kind of ignores it, and these things are automatic, so that you have this capacity to learn and to do these higher level activities. Does that all make sense to you? Okay. And unless you stop, or unless sensation is really noticeable or novel, we don't really think about a lot of these underlying sensory experiences. Okay. And so what I had to do, again, when we think about our sensory systems, you're probably very familiar with the 5 senses of touch that you might, or 5 senses that you might have learned about back in elementary school science. So, and several of you brought these forward as you were thinking about sensation here. So we have our sense of vision, we have our auditory sense of what we hear, we have taste, and we have smell. And we also have our sense of touch. The other very important senses are our sense of movement, which is detected through our vestibular system, And then our sense of proprioception, again, which really senses, it's our sense of pressure and body sense. And when we look at sensory processing and sensory integration, there's very close attention paid to what we call the near senses or body-centered senses. And those are the sense of touch, our sense of movement, and then proprioception. Those are three very powerful and very important senses that we pay attention to. The other thing I would like to acknowledge is that this information that I'm sharing with you, it's really based on the theory of sensory integration, which has been in development for the last 30 to 40 years. So it's not anything, it's not brand new. It's still evolving, but it's been around since the since the 60s and 70s, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. And I have up there the neurobehavioral theory. So really, it's thinking about brain-behavior relationships. And it's a model for understanding the relationship between sensation, brain function, and observable behavior. And it's important to acknowledge that a lot of this is a theory. So we can't see what's going on in the brain per se when we're making these hypotheses and these links between what a person is doing or experiencing and the link with how they process sensation. But it's a model, okay? That's still under development. It's being tested, and things, it keeps moving forward, but things change along the way. And this theory also gives us a framework for therapeutic techniques that support behavioral arousal, emotion, and sensory motor development as they relate to day-to-day function. And again, historically, this was pioneered by a woman named Jean Ayres, and she did her work in the 60s through the 80s. And sort of these ideas came about through her work with children with learning disabilities, and she really noticed these different patterns of behaviors in response to different kinds of sensation. And so I think what's very fascinating about this theory is that although Dr. Ayres was an occupational therapist, the theory really reflects knowledge from multiple disciplines and multiple ways of thinking. So it draws on information from child development, neuroscience, psychology, neuropsychology, and education. And as I mentioned before, this is actually quite an exciting time because in the last 10 to 15 years, there's really been some compelling research and some interesting research to help us, test the assumptions we have about this theory and to look at outcomes and to help us really develop an evidence base. So there's still a lot of questions that need to be answered, and there are new questions all the time, but particularly in the area of neuroscience, there's been some nice wedding of some ideas and strategies to understand brain function a little bit. That's giving us some insight into why these problems occur and then how the intervention may or may not work. So again, I'd like to spend some time just informing you about sensation and development. And so it's just very clear that sensation is very important and vital for early brain development in children. And when you think about infants, what are they doing as they learn about the environment and explore? How are they using their senses? They're using their mouth a lot. They're exploring objects with their mouth. There's a lot of sensory receptors in one's mouth, so they're learning through oral exploration. We also like to give them lots of bright toys with different textures, so they touch things. Every day they're learning about the relationship with the world through movement. They're learning how to sit up, to stand, to crawl and move, and to use movement to explore. So there's a lot of information that they draw on from their vestibular system and movement, learning about where they are in the world and how to interact with the world. And what we know about sensation and why it's so important is that the quality of the sensory environment really has a significant impact on the maturation of sensory systems and brain growth. And we know this because there have been studies of what happens when infants or young children are deprived of sensory experiences. So there's been studies of children who've been institutionalized and have not had the right amount of stimulation, and it really is very detrimental to their brain growth and their developmental growth. We also know that too much of the wrong kind of stimulation is also very harmful, especially in the early years. So children who are exposed to trauma or abuse, that can have very negative and profound impacts on, again, the structure and function of the brain itself. And again, we know part of this through observation and people who've documented sort of behaviors of children who have not been exposed to the right kind of stimulation, but there's also animal models that show us what happens when too much sensation or very little sensation is in the environment. So again, we also need to think about sensation development from the perspective that sensory integration does begin during fetal development. There's a lot of movement happening, and there's some early tactile development that occurs. And that rapid growth and development of sensory integrative functions really happens from birth through age 7. So again, when you think about what kids are doing and how they learn, it's that those early years where they are really doing a lot of sensory motor exploration, they're really building that foundation for later higher level learning and function. And it's also important to note that even though there's a lot of rapid growth and development early in life, it doesn't mean that after age 7 nothing happens. It doesn't. There's still change, and our and sensation continues to influence who we are and what we do in many different ways. And that doesn't mean that after age 7, if you don't fix a problem with sensory processing or integration, that there's no opportunity to make change. So I want to make that clear as well. So again, this capacity to integrate sensation really helps us attend to what is meaningful and filter what is irrelevant. And this helps us organize our behavior. And as I mentioned before, explore objects and surroundings, learn about our place in the world, especially as children. It plays a role in emotional and behavior regulation. And these are are very important foundations, not the only factors involved in how we interact with the physical and social environment, but again, they play a strong role. And as I mentioned, we're focusing on children today, and there's a lot of growth and development that happens early, but sensation is a real powerful influence throughout the lifespan, okay? And so we have a purpose for our sensory systems. They are there to protect us, okay? When there's novel stimuli, we tend to go into that fight or flight response. So again, there's a physiological reactivity that is from an evolutionary perspective, and still currently it's adaptive. So when there's a novel stimuli, such as a bug crawling on you, or a loud and alerting stimulus such as a siren that's really close, your body kind of goes into that mode of fight or flight. So your heart rate starts going up, trying to mobilize all your energy to figure out what is that threat, and decide if it's a threat or not. And then once that threat might be gone, then everything sort of settles back down, and you're in a more regulated state where you can perhaps, again, sit and attend and pay attention to some other kinds of information about your world. And also, when you think about who we are and our personality, sensation does play a role in our behaviors and habits. So we tend to avoid what we don't like or what doesn't feel good, And we like to do what makes us feel nice and feels pleasurable to us. So I think one example of that is people who really enjoy extreme sports, and that I think there's something about their sensory system that really craves a lot of intense movement and exhilarating stimulation. And so they might do a lot of those very extreme things like skydiving, etc. Whereas other people who might have a nervous system that is very different find those kind of movement activities very threatening or very scary to do. And that, again, is a reminder that our individual responses to sensation and how we regulate our behavior and coping strategies are very different and very individualized. So I'm going to talk about some just generalities about sensation and how it affects us, but really it's very different. And I think it's also important to know that while many of these responses are automatic, we also most of us have the capacity to recognize perhaps when we're becoming overstimulated or when we're feeling stress from the sensation around us. And we typically have the knowledge and the capacity to control that. So if we, one example is if there's music that's very loud, and sometimes you get used to it, but sometimes it just builds and it becomes very irritating, most of us can go, okay, that is really not making me happy, it's really annoying me, I'm going to go turn it down, or I'm going to go leave the room and go somewhere else. You have that control and that recognition, and it's when children don't have that understanding and their body just keeps going forward into that protective mode or anxious mode, that's where you start seeing some difficulty and some problems. So what is a sensory processing disorder? So we'll shift gears a little bit here. And there's sensory processing disorder, and you might have heard the term sensory integration dysfunction. I'm just curious, how many of you have actually worked with a child or been around a child or an adult who has some sensory processing difficulties? So, okay, you're all very familiar with that. Wow, so hopefully, we're going to keep learning about this. It looks like you all have some background knowledge. That's excellent. So really, sensory processing problems or disorders, it's not just one single disorder, one single problem. It's a group of problems, and it's thought to be related to subtle neural differences involving multisensory and motor systems. So I think that's important that, again, brain-based, very subtle. It's not something that we can really see or diagnose. A lot of times this is invisible disability. And multisensory, so it's typically across multiple senses, and it manifests in behavior and some motor symptoms as well. And so an more official definition is that it's really a sensory processing disorder is a diminished capacity or an inefficient capacity to modulate, discriminate, integrate, or organize sensation adaptively. So that's sort of a long definition, but essentially what happens is that there's a breakdown in the process of interpreting sensation and generating a motor or behavioral action or response. Again, that sort of matches what would be expected given the situation or the amount of stimuli that might be in the environment. And so what we know about sensory processing disorder, what we don't know actually, is that we really haven't identified a specific neural mechanism as the cause. We don't really know what causes these problems per se. It's still unknown. But what we do know is that we assume that there's normal sensory reception at the peripheral level. So we assume that the information gets in and travels on up to the brain. And it's really in the brain where sensation really goes to a lot of different places. There's a lot of sensation processed in sort of our lower level brain that has to do with emotion and regulation, but there's also a lot of that communicates a lot with the higher level areas of the brain. So it's really there's a lot going on. And so kind of to distinguish how this dysfunction sort of happens. When you think about somebody who has a spinal cord injury, typically, they have a lesion at a certain level, on their spinal cord or in their back. And so typically what happens is below that level of the lesion, the sensation doesn't even, it doesn't really come in and it can't go up to the brain. So again, what's happening with this is that information's getting in. There's no injury to that, system from the receptors to the brain. It's just once it gets up there, it kind of gets jumbled up. Okay, and it's actually a lot easier to know what's going on if somebody has an injury to the spinal cord, because that just below that level of the lesion, that's where you have the problem. And typically above, things are just fine. Things are still going to the brain. So hopefully that helps clear up sort of what's happening. And so what happens when we see these problems clinically? And so really, there's a whole range of symptoms, developmental or behavioral. So we see learning difficulties, as I mentioned before, emotional dysregulation, and a lot of motor problems. And typically it's the behavioral or social problems or motor coordination problems. Those are the reasons why parents bring kids in for a referral. Those are the sort of presenting problems. And so there are a lot of sort of primary and secondary impacts of sensory processing problems, and they can impact the child, of course. But really, it also has an impact on families and just day-to-day life. And so I have 2 video clips that I'd like to show you to sort of illustrate how these challenges present clinically. So these 2 video clips are from a 2020 episode that was actually done several years ago. I don't have the exact date on it, but I think it really provides an excellent opportunity to watch 2 children and their families and how these sensory processing difficulties have affected them. So hopefully this will all work. So those are 2 examples of, again, how these sensory processing difficulties can impact a child's day-to-day routines and parenting. And so I think, again, it's really important to think about, how do we understand these problems clinically? And what we see on the surface, if we didn't make the connection and hear about some of the specific responses to sensation, that we see kids who have a lot of mood swings. They have a hard time, kind of being in that just right state for interacting with others and learning. There's a lot of emotional reactivity. We see some aggressive behavior. We saw Tanner kind of lashing out and hitting at his mother when she tried to comb his hair. And then in Emma's case, she sort of had the opposite effect. So she sort of had some withdrawal and she wanted to run away and hide. And then you might also see inattention. Again, if you imagine how if your brain couldn't filter out all these lights and the information you're getting from the clothes and your chair and the sound, you really have a hard time paying attention to me. And then some other symptoms are clumsiness and incoordination and difficulty learning new motor skills. And when you step back, a lot of you have children, work with children, you could probably come up with a lot of explanations for these kinds of behaviors. There's a lot of different ways to explain these. And again, part of what we do as parents and professionals, we try to understand what's going on. But what happens from this perspective, as we sort of put on the sensory processing lens and we look a little closer, and we start seeing that there's sort of a pattern of symptoms, and a lot of these behaviors are connected to sensory experiences. So a lot of kids, as you saw, get upset during grooming activities, toothbrushing and bathing, and then you go, okay, well, let's think about what's going on. And, getting your hair combed, or when your teeth brushed, getting your teeth brushed, all kinds of things are happening from a sensory perspective. What sense is being stimulated a lot? Touch. A lot of these self-care activities with a lot of intensive touch kind of input. Don't like the feel of certain clothes. That's another symptom that you might see. Picky eater. So when you think about food, there's a lot of different tastes and textures with food. Kids who are frightened or bothered by loud noises, again, more so than others. The sound of the vacuum cleaner, kids hear it. And it startles a lot of kids, the sound of the vacuum cleaner, pets included, and all sorts of other people. But again, it's like a lot of us get used to it, and these kids, they don't get used to this stimulation. It's really loud, or it's really painful. And then you might see kids who jump or crash into things a lot. So they kind of, instead of running away from sensation, they crave more. So you see that a lot. I work a lot with children who've been exposed to different kinds of substances, and you see a lot of times it's hard for them to control. They want to touch everything, and they move a lot, and some kind of kids jump and crash. So they sort of have another profile where they're seeking sensation. Then you also see kids who they might they break things a lot, and they just seem clumsy, and they look like they're being careless or reckless. But what's really happening is that their sense of proprioception, or their ability to feel what their body messages are sending them from all of those near senses, don't work really hard. So they're not getting the signal that they're really pushing too hard on this object, and then suddenly it's broken. And so, again, as we think about these problems, the other thing that's important to say is that there are, I have a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, so we're just kind of coming out of that preschool mode. And, there's a lot of times in the morning where my 5-year-old doesn't want to get phoned, or it's a fight to get in the bathtub. So it's typical for some children and many of us to sort of have, sensations that we like or don't like, or there, might be things that are uncomfortable. But what we're really talking about here is we're talking about, these patterns of behavior and some of these extreme reactions that impact children's capacity to function, where it really becomes a problem. So again, I want to send that message too. I don't want anybody to, go out and start combing a 3-year-old's hair, and they start, running away and say, they don't want a ponytail in their hair. It's really not what we're talking about. It's really if you see those kinds of behaviors, these extreme reactions frequently, and really high intensity, that's really what we're talking about, where it becomes a problem. And so, again, as we talk about, well, how do we label these difficulties? What do we call them? So there's a term called sensory processing disorder, and there's sensory integration dysfunction, where there's a couple of subtypes. And so I'll just mention two today. Sensory modulation disorder, so that's really what you saw, where the problems impact behavior regulation and arousal, and then there's some sensory-based motor disorder, and we'll define that at the end. And if you talk to somebody who's really enmeshed in this field, they could probably come up with several other subtypes, but for our purposes today, we're just going to focus on these. And so what happens, a sensory modulation disorder is really, again, this more specific capacity or the inability to regulate and organize the degree, intensity, and nature of response to sensory input, again, in that manner that matches the situation at hand, or the amount of stimulation in terms of how other people might respond. And so really, we're thinking about modulation as it impacts arousal and behavior regulation and organization. And so what do we mean by modulation and arousal? And so we have a continuum of sensory responsivity, okay? And on one end, we sort of have, actually on my right here, where you have under-responsivity, and kids look under-aroused. So those are children that might not notice sensation as readily as others. And then on the other end, we have children who are oversensitive, and they're easily over-aroused, so they get into that excitable state, or that anxious state more often, where they perceive sensation as threatening or painful. And in the middle, sort of, we have this range of optimal arousal. Okay, and we think that, optimal arousal is this state of readiness for learning. So we can see this again, sort of, we have the classic arousal curve. I think many of you are probably psychology majors, so you probably are familiar with the classic arousal curve, right? So what we have sort of on one side, On the vertical axis is sort of the quality of behavior or the quality of the adaptive response. And then along the bottom is we have arousal level. And so when you think about in the morning when you wake up, unless you're a real early bird, it kind of takes time to kind of get going and to get ready for your day. You're moving from sleep to sort of a low arousal level and gradually moves up to that sort of upper peak there of optimal performance where your alertness is increasing and you're again in that more optimal state for learning. And then you kind of get over to the other end where you have high arousal. And that's where you might reach that state of disorganization, and that's where you might see anxiety or a negative emotional response. And this is another sort of visual of what we think is sort of happening with these children is sort of in the middle. You've got this optimal level of arousal, and you notice that it's really not a straight line, it's a curvy line. So it's normal. We go up and down during the day. We all do that. We also go up and down to different types of sensations. So that, that's, it's normal, but it can also be, I think, very tricky because kids show these patterns too where the behaviors, it's not always consistent and it changes, day to day, even from the beginning of the day to the end of the day. And, their response to one type of sensation at school might be different to the same type of sensation at home. Okay, so kind of back at our visual here is we've got optimal arousal in the middle, and most of us kind of stay, in that middle range when we respond to different kinds of sensory events of different intensity over time. And then we have those under responders who kind of stay at that low level, and it's really hard, even with multiple types of sensation. They can't they get up there maybe for a little bit, but it's really hard for them to stay up there. And then you've got, on the top in the red, individuals who probably start out the day in that state of overload and they just kind of stay up there. And it's really hard for them to come back down. So they're always, again, thinking about what's happening physiologically. There's a lot of stress going on the nervous system when you're in that state of anxiety all the time. So that again is the relationship between sensation and modulation. The other issue I brought up, or the other subtype, is a sensory-based motor disorder. And some people will label this as developmental dyspraxia. And so basically what this is difficulty with motor planning, and especially it's difficulty performing a new motor action or a series or sequence of motor action. And so this is all about a motor and cognitive component. And so it's not just a coordination problem. When you think about how you learn how to play tennis for the first time, you learn how to ride a bike. You have to watch somebody and you have to think really hard about how to move your body. And you're very conscious about, how you pick up that ball and, how much force you're using to pop it up in the air and how much you have to think about moving your other arm to serve the ball. So as we learn new motor skills, we really we rely on, those body-centered senses to tell us what's happening with our bodies and how to move in space, how much force to use, how much muscle power, etc. And so what happens with kids with dyspraxia is they might be able to think about the movement, but it's really hard for them to plan and organize and follow through with that movement. And there's multiple steps in there, so there's a breakdown in that between that cognitive process of thinking about doing and knowing how to do and then actually being able to do it. So you watch a child with dyspraxia do an obstacle course or try to jump in a series of jumps, and it's really hard for them to figure out how to move their body and where time and movements and move their body through space. So sensory processing disorders, they're really trying to understand, well, how often does this occur? And I just want to let you know that there are estimates that it's 5 to 15% of the general population, so these problems can occur in kids with and without disabilities. And there's been a lot of study of children just documenting, do they have sensory processing problems or not, in children with different kinds of developmental intellectual disabilities. And the prevalence is pretty high. It's much higher, 40 to 80%. So it's a very common co-occurrence to have some kind of developmental disability or intellectual problem and also have these symptoms. And so, again, there's been research done on different types of developmental disabilities. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is one, autism, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, Fragile X syndrome, and learning disabilities. So then, how are sensory processing problems identified? We're going to talk about that for a few minutes here. And so again, clinically, I think occupational therapists are one discipline that they have these problems on their radar screen. So they have a lot of clinical tools. And again, over the last several years, our tools have gotten much more standardized and systematic. Back when I started practice about 20 years ago, basically we just interview the parent, and we had a few questions to help us, but we weren't really able to compare how a 7-year-old's responses compare to other 6, 7, or 8-year-olds, that kids in that same developmental age span. But right now we have a couple of tools, and again, they are, most commonly you'll see clinicians use parent checklists. So parents get a checklist. It's divided out by different kinds of sensory domains, and they'll be asking questions about, well, in your day-to-day observations of your child, how often does your child get upset when you brush their teeth? How often does your child appear clumsy when they learn new motor skill or lose their balance? How often does your child show behaviors where they might be considered a picky eater or fussiness around meal times? And so those are the kind of questions we're getting at. And so there's one called the sensory profile, and there's developmentally it's sort of split up. Again, this would be for young children, infant and toddlers. The sort of sensory motor development is very different from what school-age children would show. And then we also have an adolescent adult sensory profile, which actually becomes a self-report questionnaire. So people are thinking about how they respond to different kinds of sensation and how that influences their behavior. And then you'll also note that for the sensory processing measure, it's another tool. There's a home form and then there's a classroom and school environments form. And so the message here is that context is really important, and that sensory demands, the sensory load of different environments are very different. And behavior expectations are very different, especially across school environments. So there's a capacity to think about a child, okay, how are they doing at home in response to sensation? How are they doing in PE? There's a lot of movement demands and other kinds of sensation. How are they doing in the cafeteria? A lot of unstructured movement, a lot of smells, a lot of sounds, and a lot of times some of those other environments can be very hard for sensory processing problems. The other way we evaluate these problems is we have some standardized performance-based tests, and sort of the gold standard is known as the sensory integration and praxis test, and this is getting a lot at the motor planning and the dyspraxia issues that I mentioned before. And then we also use observations, and that's, again, really important because the questionnaires and some of the standardized tests only tell us so much, but there are some ways of looking at movement. So there's some formal structured ways that therapists might look at in terms of the quality of the child's movement. How do we go exploring the world around them physically? Does it look easy for them? Are the movements smooth, or is it, again, very uncoordinated movement? Or are they very hesitant to go out explore. And those might be done in like a clinical setting. And then we have informal observations in natural settings. So again, really going out and watching a child on the playground and navigate playground equipment. How are they getting along with other kids? How are they, interacting in the classroom when they're standing in line and there's a lot of kids around them, or there's a lot of maybe unexpected sensation. Can they tolerate that? Or is that where they begin to act out and things become difficult? So again, there's no one tool that will magically diagnose the sensory processing disorder. There's no one behavior. So it's really, again, these patterns of behavior we're looking at, and we're also, again, since we can't see the brain, we're really trying to strengthen our sort of guesses about the behavior and sensation with as much data as possible. So that's from what parents say, and then, we're looking at them too. Do we see these difficulties when we're just watching them, and then are there other tests that tell us, wow, compared to other kids of the same age, this child is really responding atypically, really over-responding, or really not responding enough to sensation. So it's detective work, like I said, and context really matters. So by that, I mean it's very important to think about how children behave across settings. And the impact on function matters. As I said before, a sensitivity to this here and a sensitivity to that there is not uncommon in young children and in adults. It's these consistent patterns and the significant impact this has on function that really tells us when it's a problem. And the other thing to think about in terms of context is that, sometimes there are children who they sort of make it through the school day. There's a lot of sensory demands and they hold it together, and then they come home and they fall apart. And so, the parents are seeing this at home, and the parent observations might be very different than the teacher observation. But that's really something to talk about. And, again, you think about expectations and kids' energy and maybe their ability to hold it together. And, that's something that you might see too, is that, just the timing of when things are in the day, or the demands or the load of the environment that, again, might be home, or it might be an event out in the community. That child might just be holding it together with all they can, barely making it, and then they sort of have that opportunity to just let go, and then they sort of melt down or fall apart. So it's important to think about. And so, again, I think historically there's been this question, well, is this a valid problem? Is this a valid syndrome? And I think, again, recently the research is telling us yes, that children who have patterns of these behavioral symptoms, these difficulties, we see differences in how they react physiologically to stress. We see that we can measure that their bodies respond, nervous systems respond with more of a stress response. And then we also see that there's been some studies done in response to event-related potentials, and we see that their brains don't filter or get used to information as well as children who don't report these problems. So there's some growing evidence to say, yeah, there are some true brain-based differences and some true differences in how a child's nervous system reacts to sensory input. So, what can be done to treat sensory processing problems is probably a question that you're all wondering about. And there's various different intervention approaches. There's no one magic recipe or cookbook, but I like to think about sort of 4 different approaches. And so, again, my goal here is to familiarize you with what might be done in the event that you are a teacher and, a therapist walks into your room and gives you this big, stability ball and tells you to how'd you have this child sit on the stability ball during class? And you're kind of like, what? Or, again, it's to sort of give you a little bit of insight into how these interventions might work and why they might be used. So the first one is education and how that helps us reframe behavior, which I think is really very powerful, which I hope, part of all of you being in the audience is a bit of education and that you're picking up some ideas for reframing behavior already. And then there's individual direct intervention, very intensive. And then we have what we refer to as sensory-based interventions. So sensory-based strategies or tools, as I mentioned, it might be like a stability ball or a therapy ball. And that, these are things that might be provided for a child in the home or the classroom, or just some ideas to help children cope with sensation. And then there's a lot of things to think about in terms of modifying environments and daily routines and activities. So why should we even consider sensory-based interventions? Well, again, when we think about what sensation is and what it does, it has a very powerful impact on the nervous system and brain. So again, we're trying to impact sort of that CNS, central nervous system state of readiness for learning. And so there's sensation that's very excitatory in general, and then there's sensation that, again, sort of brings the nervous system down, and we'll talk about what those are. And it can be very valuable to know how a child reacts to sensation, and then being aware of how much sensation is present in the environment. That can help us, again, make that child environment fit a little stronger and help us understand behaviors, but also guide intervention. And so this is, again, really important to think about in terms of where and what we're trying to affect. A lot of intervention is targeted by changing the child, and there are certainly parts of intervention or types of interventions that are aimed at trying to help the child tolerate sensation, be more comfortable with sensation, and we're kind of building on this idea of neuroplasticity, that especially if you see a young child, that a sensory-rich environment and these ideas will really help change the child's nervous system to respond in a more balanced manner. But we also need to think about the task. Whatever they're doing, the activity, there might be a lot of sensory demands in that activity. And so maybe it's not the child that we need to change, but probably an unfair expectation. Maybe we just need to change our expectations or alter the task. And then, again, what's really important, especially I think in our Western world, is we need to think about the sensory load of the physical environment, the sensory load of the social environment. So people and busy places, grocery stores, retail stores. There's a lot of stimulation going on in those kinds of environments. And when you stop and go, oh, and you really notice everything, you just go, oh my. I tend to do an exercise with my occupational therapy students and do send them out to the grocery store, for example, and they don't go in with a grocery list. They're supposed to go in and just take it all in. And it's sort of this eye-opening experience where they're like, wow, there's really a lot going on here. All these smells, and some people bump into them, and you might be in a place where there's music or TVs blaring, and so we sort of have environments that can be kind of aversive, and I think are hard to tolerate. And so we also have to think about that. We're always pinning things on the child as the child having a problem, but when it comes right down to it, and we start looking at some of our environments, they're pretty high sensory stimulation. And so again, this problem-solving approach is you're kind of coming in, you're not just targeted at changing one thing, but you want to be comprehensive, and you're thinking about all these possibilities. And so the first one I'd like to talk about is reframing behavior. And again, I personally think this is very powerful it really, when you look at Tanner, when you look at Emma, you see an aggressive behavior on the surface. And, your first reaction might be to punish that child for hitting somebody. And so when you think about behavior through the sensory processing lens, suddenly, I think in most cases you would decide, well, that probably wasn't a willful hit or an aggressive intention. It was a reaction because that child was in that, alert mode or fight or fight mode and was threatened. And so you begin to think, okay, you're not going to provide a negative consequence for the child, you're going to react differently. And I think a lot of parents feel like suddenly, there's an explanation for some of these behaviors. So, these are some ideas that, again, playground attacks or, until I understood tactile defensiveness, so being hypersensitive to touch, I didn't really know how to explain maybe sudden outbursts on the playground. Or poor body awareness explains how, my child kept knocking over glasses of juice unintentionally bumping into kids when running across the play area. So again, it's sort of that, the child's not knocking over the juice to get attention or to be bad. They just really don't have a good sense of where their arm might be or good control of their body, and there goes the juice. And so I like to put this little picture up. I had another one, actually, I couldn't dig it up, couldn't access it, of my daughter who's riding around in a little ladybug merry-go-round at the carnival, and she's just beat red and screaming. And, I can imagine the hot day the sun was out and she's spinning around in circles. So that sort of illustrates, well, she's very unhappy because I'm sure the sensory demands are really awful and overloading the system. But I've got this other picture here, and, it's an infant, and a lot of us see a crying infant and we kind of think, okay, maybe he's hungry, diaper change, all sorts of things like that. So if you were to look through this sensory processing lens, what might you think about in terms of why that child might be upset? The clothing is probably awful scratching pumpkin costume. It's going crazy. Take it off. How's that little baby sitting? Nice and straight or kind of drifting off to the side? So it's like I'm sensing that my body position's off here. Help me get upright again. Or, maybe it's just nap time. So, again, there's a lot of explanations you don't know. And the reason I bring up the baby is that we do, as parents and caregivers, a lot of sensory-based interventions sort of intuitively, okay? We may not think about this explicitly in terms of child behaviors, but when you think about when kids are upset, we are the external regulators for babies and infants. What do we do when they're crying? What do we do? Move them up and down, nice and slow and rhythmically. Some kids we swaddle, so we give them a lot of deep pressure sensory inputs. We might sing in a very soft, soothing way. So a lot of these principles and how sensation affects the nervous system are things that people do with babies. And so you kind of have to shift. Okay, when kids, can't walk, you give them a walker, you help them that way. When kids, don't have the motor control to feed them, you help them feed. So when kids can't regulate their behavior, you're just carrying forth some of those developmental applications a little longer down the road. So in that case, again, it doesn't seem as odd or unusual or as novel in terms of the kinds of interventions we're talking about. So there are some direct intervention techniques, and these are very clinically based, and they're typically occupational therapists, so the profession that will provide these, and typically these require postgraduate training, so they're specialized clinical interventions. And it's really the therapeutic use of sensation to build a child's capacity to function, and it's very play-based. So I'm going to show you what it is. The best way to describe this is to just watch it. So I'm going to switch this here. So this idea that, she's standing by the ball pit, and a child who is threatened by sensation, they're kind of on the edge there's a lot of tactile input. That's a lot of work for her to want to go in there, but hopefully all those colors and the playfulness about it sort of overrides that fear, and then there she goes and she gets used to it, and there's different strategies in how the sequence of sensory input is applied. So if a child is starting to feel, overly excited and out of control, there's some ways to, watch the child and sort of bring them back down and bring them back into that balanced state, okay? And again, this is all very play-based. I think that's very important. And then it's an approach where you're watching the child. You want the child to explore. You're encouraging, but you're not forcing. And then you're also, again, systematically varying the sensation, using the sensation very therapeutically. Does anybody have any questions? Again, that was a very short clip, but have some of you seen a therapy journey?
Is there a specific age that this tends to be more noticeable, or does it just vary based on child or youth?
A specific age in terms of when a child might present with these problems? It depends on the child. I mean, there's some infants that you can see the reactivity, and it's problematic. There's some kids that they may be doing okay, and then the environmental demands increase, like they start preschool, or you're expecting them to do more things on their own or grow out of that resistance to doing those kinds of grooming activities, and then wait a minute, there's something else going on here. So it's very low. So again, typically that kind of intervention, you go to a clinic once or twice a week for a couple of months, so it takes a while and it's more intensive. And then we have sensory-based interventions. So it's sort of this. Oops, that's right. Sorry about that. There we go. All right. So these are different kinds of strategies and tools, and they're really aimed at sensory modulation. So they're trying to get that child into that arousal state so that they can pay attention. And so they're ready to learn and they're ready to participate. And I've got that term occupational performance and what that means for kids. That's kind of OT speak. Is that they're ready to play with other kids. They're ready to interact on the playground. They're ready to sit in school and learn. They're ready to be out in the community and participate in team sport. And so what happens with these is that we think about them as sort of routine-based interventions. And some people call them sensory diets. And it's this idea that providing sensory activities will really nourish a child's development. And the idea is to embed them into daily routines, because an hour of therapy a week, that's just a very small amount of time, and sensation happens every day. Children grow and develop every day. So you're thinking about ways to increase sensation for a child who might eat more on a day-to-day basis. You're thinking about ways to decrease that sensation if you decide that that child is showing hypersensitivities to different kinds of sensation, or you're trying to eliminate. Again, it's sort of this trying to navigate, taking in all this information, negotiating. Well, what can be changed and what can be added, and how does this affect the child's life or family life? You have a question?
Yes. What happens if you have been working with a teen with a sensory diet for a while and it seems like they're almost insatiable with, like they'll respond to it at the time, and then at the time that they're using their diet, they stop using the diet and then immediately are on overload sensory-wise.
So when the diet's taken away,
now they're asked to self-regulate, but then they can't. They disconnect from their diet.
So I'm hoping I'm understanding your question correctly, is that you think about a child who has a sensory processing problem. You prescribe or you give them or you suggest that they participate in all these activities. And then you take it away and they go back to what they were doing before. Basically, they still need it and they can't regulate.
So the example would be my son goes through a yoga routine, his skin brushing routine, and he goes through like an hour worth of stuff every morning before he goes to school. Immediately when he's done, he's disconnected with it, and there's no carryover into regular routine.
That's a good question. So my first thought was that, maybe, one would expect that this sort of problem would go away. And I'm not answering your question directly, but I think there's this idea that, you kind of have this, you're born with this nervous system, sort of like you're born with temperament and personality, and you can change some aspects a little bit, but you always are these core elements that define you, so you have to figure out ways to cope with or change what you can, and sometimes you're not going to change, you just have to cope. But the other point you're getting at is that, there's some very limited effects of what you might be providing for your child in terms of affecting behavior beyond just that little bit of intervention that you're doing. And it sounds like you're working very hard. And I guess that would be the question. I think that's the question that I ask as a clinician, that all of you should ask as, a possible consumer is, at what point, how do you decide whether an intervention is working or not? Because we have limited but growing evidence for this type of intervention, and there's so many pieces or different kinds of intervention, so it's really up to, to who's involved in the intervention to kind of step back and go, okay, we expect, a behavior change, we expect behavior B to change, and we expect behavior C to change. And be very clear about what it is you want to change, and you figure out a way to monitor that change. And if you don't see change, then the intervention may not be working. So, I think that's a really important reality with these. There's a lot of trial and error, and you have to be, I think, systematic and deliberate about deciding, do these really work? Because, as our research base grows, we're finding, some of these things are working, but we're also finding that, things that we think are therapeutic and should have a certain effect aren't. So I'll mention that sort of at the end. But, it's trial and error, and really if something's not working, then it may not be the right match. You have to decide if it's worth continuing or not. And that's not an easy decision to make and think about it. So then we're talking about sort of these routine-based interventions and using sensation therapeutically. So there's some general properties that different kinds of sensation have, and so we'll be very straightforward that some types of sensation are kind of inhibitory for the nervous system and kind of lower your level of arousal, and some are more excitatory. And so some examples, again, there's principles behind the therapeutic strategies that might be applied, and things like deep touch pressure to the skin or the body, warm stimuli, slow rhythmic music, proprioceptive activities where there's heavy muscle work, pushing and pulling, etc. Those are things that might be used to kind of bring a child who's up here sort of down, back to that balance. And then we think about swings and linear movement, okay, just back and forth again, back to, what's done sometimes with babies and young kids is that slow linear rocking. Sometimes linear movement in a car can put people to sleep. And so then we see that there might be sensation to increase arousal, and even the same type of stimuli. So actually my daughter on this thing, you kind of move it in circles and you move it really fast and irregularly, and it has the opposite effect. So it kind of wakes them up and it's exciting and it's fun, and a child goes from kind of sleepy or getting ready to sleep to like, woohoo, ready to interact with the world and having fun. Light touch or a tickle, that can be a more stimulating kind of touch input. Cold, bright lights, more upbeat music, and then just things that are novel can in and of themselves be sort of arousing. And I want to also make one more point that I was going to mention earlier and I didn't, and that is that as children develop, again, most kids, they'll sort of, in terms of, that sensory nourishment, as I mentioned, we need sensation, or, we thrive on sensation, we depend on sensation. Kids will go out and do that on their own. So most kids, they'll go out and run around on the playground. They want that movement and that stimulation. Again, depending on their age, they'll seek out those sensory experiences. Most kids, love to finger paint, they love to play with water. When we go into a preschool classroom, we see all those fun, exciting things. And kids will, again, for the most part, they'll seek things out, they'll participate, and they'll sort of stop. Not always, but they'll kind of, when they have had enough, they've had enough, and so they're able to do this. And so what the principles behind this type of these types of sensory strategies is that these kids maybe need a little more help in terms of getting more or getting less, and you're helping the kids with that regulation, or your therapist helping that child with that regulation. And so just a couple of examples of sensory tools. Again, movement is a very, very powerful and rich type of sensory stimulation. So we talk about this concept of heavy work. And so this idea of getting the muscles active, and this input on the joint and the body, pushing, pulling, jumping, doing yoga, you're really helping to modulate that child's behavior. Sometimes movement is as simple as, when we sit in a chair in a classroom, we're not getting a lot of stimulation per se. And again, movement and gravity, gravity's always sort of keeping our brains alert. And so just simply, standing up or doing an alternative position might be a possible therapeutic strategy that can be used. And then, we've got movement breaks and recess. And, again, thinking about, it's really important to have, positive behavior supports and school-wide behavior plans and whatnot too. But I think a lot of kids, like a consequence for misbehaving is losing recess, and teachers have to do what they have to do to manage their classroom. And I've spent time in my children's classroom, and I think, have great respect for all educators. It's a hard job. But thinking about the benefits of movement, and they've shown that moving can help with attention and alertness too. So those movement breaks and recess, it's very healthy. Needless to say, there's also the physical fitness benefits that come along with movement too. So some other kinds of tools would be providing just a place for kids to sort of cool down. So when they need a break, instead of, as an alternative to time out as appropriate, just a place where they can shut out the world for a while and regroup. And, ideally you're teaching kids to recognize their state so that eventually you don't have to remind them to go, cool down, but they'll go seek it out themselves. And then these are just some examples of dynamic seating. So again, alternative kinds of seating to provide some kinds of movement input. You might see some people prescribing, or not prescribing, but recommending little fidget toys so kids have something to do with their hands. Kids who like to seek sensory stimulation, and sometimes it helps, with attending behaviors, but it can also be problematic because they can turn, into a toy, and you need to have rules and limits. So that's, I'm showing you these, range of different strategies, and it's not, one person's decisions. These kinds of things have to fit within the environment. They have to be acceptable, and they can't be distracting or a nuisance to other, children or educators. So thinking about adaptations or accommodations also in daily routines. So we saw dressing, fabric, different textures of clothing. They are very They can be very aversive and a lot of sensory stimulation. So there's different adaptations. So there might be seamless socks, seamless underwear, or just cotton pants versus jeans. So this is this idea that if you understand, a child who is resisting getting dressed in the morning, if you think, well, maybe from a sensory perspective, it's the feel of the fabric, then you just, you don't expect that child to, suddenly like a pair of jeans. It might be that cotton pants, you're going to be okay with that, or look for those seamless kinds of items. And then, as I mentioned before, you think about out in the community, and I've been one of those parents where, you're kind of in the middle of the grocery store and there's a complete meltdown and people are looking at you and your child is screaming and you're like, what do you do? But thinking about a meltdown in a grocery store and thinking about all that stimulation, wow, they may be exhausted. This may be like Aaron, number 2, and they're a toddler, so they've been in and out of the car, you've been touching them, they've been moving. There's new information coming in constantly. And, a therapist might negotiate, well, there could be this sensory overload that the child's experiencing. Is it reasonable for you to, change your, when you go to the grocery store? Or can you have, somebody else watch the child while you do that? It may not be an option, so you have to figure out other ways. But those are the kinds of things that I think you bring forward to a parent or a caregiver, and you negotiate and figure out alternatives. And we've had children who, school assemblies, so a lot of background noise, are really loud, they're really hard to be around, or even fire drills. It's really hard to say that, a child can't do a fire drill. It's one of those safety things that you really can't necessarily change the expectation, but maybe you can, warn the child that there's going to be one, or you have headphones available, and that helps that child with autism or some other problems, who has some auditory sensitivities, sort of participate and cope at the same time without, excluding them from that expectation. And this is a great one, actually. This was actually a couple of parents came up with this idea. This was a summer camp, family summer camp, and this was a big mess hall. This is where they had lunch. And so you can see that the cement is all very bumpy. So can you imagine what it sounded like when, 40 chairs were being pulled out to have people sit down for dinner? They're still at camp. There's nowhere else to eat. And there's all these chairs and this noise, so what do? Can't get new chairs, can't get carpet either. So somebody came up with the idea of tennis balls, and they put those on the chairs, and it really took care of a lot of that background noise. So we talk about changing the environment, and this is an example of sort of, you gotta be creative, think out of the box, but it's also this reality that you can't always change the environment, and so you have to work with what you have sometimes. That's really important to remember. And I'll mention one more intervention here, and then be ready for questions. So there's another program, it's called the Alert Program, and so this is a little different. It's a program that teaches children, parents, and teachers how to recognize arousal states. And so they're thinking about arousal, but they're also expanding self-regulation strategies. So they're using a lot of sensory motor-based strategies. So the things that we just talked about, movement, pressure, or other kinds of sensory input. And this is a program that provides a framework for just vocabulary and activities to help children recognize and regulate. And so this is just they use the analogy of a car engine. And so you're helping children understand when their engines are running at high speed, when they need to calm down, when they're at low speed, when they need to come up a little bit and just right, when they're kind of ready to go and balance and ready for learning. And so there's a whole set of activities and methods to help teach this to the child. And again, this was developed for 8 to 12-year-olds with learning disabilities, but really it's been adapted and expanded for younger kids, and kids functioning developmentally a little bit lower with different cognitive abilities. And you can use those individually or in group sessions. So again, ideally you want to have children recognize their arousal states if they have the cognitive capacity to be able to do some of this on their own. And then kind of back to your question too, do these problems go away? And I think you have to have this perspective that over development, they sort of ebb and flow. The child might master self-regulation and their performance in one environment, and maybe then the environment changes, or the developmental expectation changes, or maybe just, physically they're changing as, they get older. So, it's always something that you should keep in mind, and you have to revisit and adjust. Maybe, you won't need it. There's no guarantee, but, again, there's, you're probably always monitoring, thinking about the strategies. They're still working, or if they remain developmentally appropriate, etc. And so then, again, I sort of put out the question, does intervention work? And so as consumers, and as therapists as well, we have to ask that question. And I'm just bringing up 2 examples. There is research, the research evidence is growing. And so there have been a couple of studies done on the dynamic seating or sitting on the stability balls. And so these have been done with a very small number of kids, but they've been done in the classroom. And these particular studies focused on 4th and 5th graders with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And so they actually, had the kids on the balls in the classroom, and they monitored their in-seat behaviors every 10 seconds for a period of time, and then they looked at how their legibility on a writing assignment, and they found for this small number of kids that there was really positive changes in that the kids really sat in the chairs longer, and there were more attending behaviors, and that their legibility and their written word output improved when they compared that to the class mean. So again, very small, but promising in terms of, there were some very positive changes for some of these kids. And then weighted vests are another example of an intervention. I don't have a picture of that, but basically it's just like a little vest, and typically there's small weights put in, so there's this idea that there's some deep pressure on the child's chest, and that can be kind of grounding and centering, and help the child, feel that balance of their sensory modulation. And so there's been several studies done on that, and somebody in 2009 actually kind of went through the literature and compiled all those studies together, and we don't know how many exactly, but 9 or 10 studies. Is there collective evidence that says these weighted vests work? And they really said, well, not really. So, but again, that's not to say that one intervention would not work for that one child, but you have to be careful, and you have to figure out a way of monitoring what you want to change. Because again, you need to watch that carefully, and also then be careful, because you open up a catalog, you could go on the internet, you can buy a lot of these things, a lot of cool, fun-looking sensory activities and items, cost a lot of money, and so it's just that idea that you have to be careful and make good decisions around what might work, and make informed decisions what might not. So, and then the occupational therapy intervention using a sensory integrative approach, again, thinking, in the clinic when you have a child going through the more individualized intensive intervention, this is all just emerging, and, there's some promising results that says, when kids go through this intervention that, the families might set some goals, and that they're making these changes on these goals that are important to the family, that there's some changes in the child's attention, cognitive and social behaviors, and then some trends where they see on some of these sensory processing measures the behaviors change, or the child behaviors change, or the physiological reactivity change. But some of this is preliminary, and so they're working on things replicating and doing them with larger numbers of children, different diagnoses. So that's happening, and I think it's very exciting, because historically there have been some negative results, and these kinds of things don't work, but Now we have better ways of measuring, more systematic ways of applying the methods. And so, I continue to be optimistic that there'll be more clinical evidence to support some of these interventions. So it's about 8:30, and so what I hoped you walked away with today is this understanding of how sensation affects development and the important role it plays, not only in children, but how it influences our behavior, throughout life as adults. And then sort of understanding of sensory processing disorders and how some of these challenging behaviors can stem from some of these difficulties responding in an adaptive way, difficulties organizing sensation for use. And that can be they can have very strong impacts on how children function and how children function within the context of their families. And then finally, I hope that you have an idea about sort of what types of interventions fall under this realm of sensory-based intervention or sensory integration treatment, and then kind of a little bit more understanding of why they're used and how they're used to intervene with children who might be having difficulties. So with that, I have a few resources. You're welcome to cut these down. There's 2 websites that are really, the Sensory Processing Disorder Network is really informative in terms of some of the clinical as well as research to understand this disorder. And then there's other, I think, very family and very teacher-friendly kinds of toolkits provided by Henry OT Services. And then you're welcome to take a look at some of those. There's a lot of books too that I think if you're interested in more reading and more understanding that I would recommend. And the last one is just if those of you who are more interested in the state of research and sort of a summary of the research findings to date and sort of where people are looking to go in the future with research and kind of, again, collaborating with some of the efforts in neuroscience research. The last one there, Miller, Mason, and Brett Green, that's a good overview of where things have, sort of what's happening, where things are going. With that, I'm happy to take some questions. So.
For the linear movement and the swinging, we're not allowed to have swings anymore in playgrounds. I really see that as a lack in our playgrounds, and I'm trying to think of what we can do about it, what could replace that.
Well, that's a good question. Again, I think this movement, running and playing outside, engaging in active play on a playground, and they're still going down a slide. Kids can still get a lot of sensory input from stationary play equipment, and again, there's safety issues that have that have changed the way playgrounds are structured.
Also, the heavy pushing and pulling when you get a wagon. What do you?
That's where you can be creative, and there's all sorts of ideas. So sometimes to get heavy work activity in a very compact space, a therapist might say, okay, do a little push-up on your chair. Go to the wall and do a wall push-up. Otherwise, filling up a wagon, pulling a wagon full of stuff at home, before dinner, maybe that's going to help them kind of get in that state of readiness and be able to sit down and eat dinner. So that might be something you might do, before dinner. As an example, heavy work is, again, pushing and pulling, but it's, the toy, got some stuff, that wagon has some heavier objects in it. So those are some ideas. So yeah, again, the list is sort of endless, and this is where you can be as creative as you want, but also you have to just remember safety, because kids with these problems might also have poor body awareness, and they also may have less awareness of their own central, nervous system state. So, it might require more supervision and more monitoring than you would for children with more typical development. So I just have to say safety, and that's another reason to be careful. Sometimes things are not appropriate for classrooms unless there's, certain safety parameters in place, and you have to be careful about what kind of things are, left with teachers or left with parents without some close monitoring. So,
Anything in the literature that would suggest sensory integration issues may run in families? Is there a hereditary component to this?
Can you repeat the question?
the question is there anything in the literature that suggests that these disorders are hereditary? And I can't answer that right now, but I do believe there was a recent study done that I had just glanced at and I have yet to read, where they were looking at those issues in terms of, families and making some connection, trying to answer that question. People are asking that question, so, but I can't, I'm not informed at the moment to answer that. So,
As far as how it pertains to executive function, for instance, my son has significant executive function deficits. And how does that correlate to dyspraxia when a huge component of that sensory piece involves planning and organization? So if you have somebody that's got both.
That's an excellent question.
And I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
It's an excellent question, and I think it's one that, deserves research to answer it. I can say that I recently completed a study where we were looking at kids with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and we were looking at sensory processing and parenting stress, and we were looking at aspects of executive function, behavior regulation, but also some of the more working memory, planning, and organization. And we found that there was a really strong relationship between the sensory processing and the behavior regulation piece, and the parenting stress together. So that aspect of, executive control over some of the behavior regulation seems to be an issue, and it's hard to separate. And I think it deserves, again, more inquiry. I think there's definitely issues of executive function and planning involved in motor development. I don't think we come at it the same way a psychologist has from the executive function perspective, but that's not to say that there isn't a relationship. I just don't think it has been investigated or applied enough within this framework. But it's something, theoretically, the idea is that a lot of this stuff is integrated at lower levels of the brain. But, again, we think about how pervasive sensation is and all the networks and communications that happen across the sensation. There's probably a role in there somewhere that needs to be better defined. So, go ahead.
As a child psychologist who I can pretty easily diagnose this in many, many of my patients, and it's very frustrating to find referrals and where to send the kids. And you can't just send them to any OT because not all OTs really get sensory integration.
Right.
And, Children's doesn't have a group that I'm aware of that does sensory integration. UW. So, okay, so I'd love to hear some ideas of where people really, referral sources where there is good, Rosemary White's clinic's great, but it's a forever wait to get in there. And, I'm really limited on where I can send the kids.
Cascade Children.
Yeah, I know Cascade's children.
And they've been brilliant.
Yeah, they're good, but they get a wait list too. Yeah, Cascade is good. That's kind of more Boswell-Lindenville.
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer. It's really hard, and the supply is sort of limited compared to the demand. And I think most occupational therapists would say you also have to be careful. Granted, this is a specialty area of practice, but it's still like occupational therapy, and sensory integration is one approach. And it's typically not the only approach to use with kids. Usually it's combined. And again, I think personally, people might have other opinions of this, but I think just this aspect of education, understanding, and behavioral reframing to be able to look at a behavior and to think about possible, sensory causes for that behavior or sensory relationships. There's just some things in that detective work or that problem-solving process where you're trying to understand the intent of the behavior where, you can play around with that a little bit without actually having to go, for the intensive intervention. I mean, the therapist guidance is important and helpful, but, again, I think just recognizing some of the sensory possibilities and adjusting the environment. And those are ways that you can be responsive, I guess, in that time of waiting, if that makes sense. So,
I was really interested in your comments regarding modulation of the sensory loading or input. We have two boys that are toddlers and another one's apart, and they both seem to have some modular processing integrated disorders. And one is like over-responsive and one is under-responsive. And I'm very interested in, and they're both starting occupational therapy, but I'm interested in modulating the sensory loading that you were talking about and getting more resources for that. Do you have ideas for us?
Again, I think, there are some of the books that I have that I've referenced. There's some ideas. I think having that dialogue with, the therapist that you're working with, this is really important. For me to think about at home, what can I do at home? And, again, it's really hard. The detective work isn't easy, and so having that conversation and that person to help you with, the trial and error and to be able to, again, go through that problem-solving process and decide, well, maybe, this would work, and this, routine, we can't change this, or, we can't change this about our home, but, so you're working within the context of what you can change and what you can't, and you're thinking about those principles and being creative. So that's a really hard question to answer specifically, but, again, looking at some of those ideas, thinking about the child's thresholds and needs, and then figuring out those, sensory diets or those changes that you can make that are realistic, for your family or for your home. It's not something you can do in, 1 week. It really takes some time and some, dialogue. Does that? I know that's.
I was just wondering, are there like sensory camps? I know that's probably a stupid question. I'm a novice at this.
I think there are camps that are available for children who have sensory processing problems. I don't know of any offhand right in this area. I know a couple of different places in the country that
How old are the kids?
One's 3 and one's 4.
And go to Rosemary White's campus. Great summer camp.
Again, there might be some value in if you have some information to share with each other to share those opportunities. So, go ahead.
I come at this as an organizational psychologist. I look at things from a little bit different perspective. What's the range of adaptation that you see as adults, or do we know much about that yet?
That is an excellent question, and I think there is more clinical attention to sensory processing issues in adults as of lately. I don't know of any, controlled interventions trials that I can say this has been tried on adults and this works or this doesn't. I think people are also, again, sort of stepping outside of the realm of developmental problems. People are thinking about these issues for individuals maybe following a brain injury, thinking about this relatively post-traumatic stress disorder, how that influences, behavior, triggers things. So it gets very complicated, I think, in adults. But people are thinking about it and using it to try to understand behavior.
I feel it's important when you talk about behavioral reframing to also acknowledge that there can be other components, pieces of the puzzle and comorbidity, so that in the topic of severe behavior disorder, sensory need, et cetera, do you need to simultaneously address them? How's the best method?
So you're asking about, in kids with very complex emotional behavior disorder, how do you think about sensation along with other possible causes for behavior? That is a very good question, and there was some intervention work that a colleague of mine did, who was a psychologist. She was the lead, and basically the intervention, it was 4 challenging behaviors, and it was carried out by some mental health psychologists or therapists, and it was direct work with families and trying to understand behavior. And so what we did is use kind of principles of modified functional behavior analysis. And so you're just inserting sensory antecedents as a possibility amongst all the other usual things that you might consider as, the link or the antecedent to a challenging behavior. And then, again, there's this idea that, as a positive behavior support, you might also include some of these sensory-based techniques to help with the behaviors. But I think with the kids who are really complex, there's never one answer, and it's never simply one problem. So it's really looking at the behavior in different contexts and deciding, doing that detective work. So that's the best I can say, is that, in those situations, again, having those different lenses to look at behavior through, and including sensory processing as one of those lenses that can help with some behaviors. It can't help all behaviors, and it may be irrelevant to many behaviors, but it can help, I think, for some. Does that answer your question adequately? So there's a lot of, I think, beauty in, the team process and multidisciplinary consultation. I really am a firm believer of that, because I think, as OTs too, working closely with psychologists or other teachers, special educators, we have those multiple perspectives to figure out the behaviors. So,
I'm wondering if there's a known link between sensory processing disorder and stereotypical.
That's a good question. People have studied that. And so I think the idea is that some of the stereotypical movements you might see, so the question was, is there a link between sensation and stereotypical movement in children with autism, self-stimulatory behaviors, right? And I think the idea is that, yes, there's, some of it, there might be a sensory basis for some of those behaviors. And I think we're still working on, what our interventions, they're again very individualized. I think clinically people anecdotally report that, providing sensation, movement or deep pressure touch can have some effects on, the goal would be to reduce those self-stimulatory behaviors that might manifest from a sensory need. So it is one application, but I can't, speak to, an evidence base per se.
So it could be, in a way, it could be an effect of the sensory level?
It might be. I think the idea is that, it could be an effect if they're stressed. It might be a stress response, so it might be more of a self-soothing kind of behavior, but it also might be more of a sensory-seeking behavior. So again, it's hard to know. You're making some guesses, and you just have to gather your information, keep observing that child and trying things to see if your guess is correct or not, if that makes sense. But certainly that has been linked together. Sensation and self-stimulatory behaviors have been linked together. Another question?
Yeah, kind of tagging along about complex cases. So we're already tackling this from a behavioral perspective, but I wondered if you had any recommendations for an OT that believes in the behavioral perspective, that also understands, self-injurious behavior and stereotypy in the southern end, so it's common area. I wondered if you had something that you can recommend.
Yeah, I would have to think about that.
Okay. So you've kind of been through multiple OTs and just not not been an ideal match.
Yeah, so maybe you can stop up here after. I don't know the answer to that offhand.
Okay.
So,
Text would be helpful.
yeah, but again, I think that team process is very important, and you need to take on complex behaviors from multiple perspectives and troubleshoot from multiple perspectives also.
I know that research has been done in this area, but I'm thinking of children and their exposure to technology in terms of dysregulation, even computer time. Children, is that a concern in terms of even visual stimulation, auditory stimulation that comes to children? They can actually be aversive and set a typically developing child off on the down trajectory.
That's a really good question. I don't feel like I can answer that scientifically. I could probably make some guesses, but does anybody else want to contribute? I think the question is, sorry, I didn't repeat that. Computer time, screen time, computer visual and auditory stimulation, is that changing how kids develop or behave? More sensitive or less sensitive to certain stimuli? And I don't know the answer, scientifically based on research. I know they're not getting movement. They're sitting down more, and that's a concern in multiple areas, not just for behavior, but just physical fitness. But there are, I think when you think about young children, their movement and a relationship with the physical world is very important. And when you're interacting, virtually, I think there's probably limits are probably a good idea. And I think there's some limits, for younger children in particular. But I don't feel like I can, speak to that in a way that I can recommend something, because I just don't know all that literature or what's even been investigated off the top of my head. So. Yes.
What would your advice be to a parent who suspects possible sensory processing disorder, maybe even just at a mild level of where to start, whether that's through school or pediatrician or?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are occupational therapists around in the schools, but sometimes, for mild problems, and if it's not really affecting a child's school performance, that may not be the best route. There are different clinics around locally, and I'm trying to think of the best way to actually access, different clinics to see if, they even, I don't want to say specialize, but offer those kinds of assessments and interventions. And I know I have that information, but I don't know if there's a repository of that. It certainly would be something to think about, just in terms of, there's a state organization, the Washington Occupational Therapy Association, that might have some information about practitioners and people that can be that are available for these kinds of assessments in different areas of the state. So,
because I think didn't you mention some postgraduate specialty studies for occupational therapists?
Well, a lot of, therapists will, it's really hard to do this. This work takes more development and more continuing education. So that's what I mean. It's really, therapists who do this a lot tend to, take a lot more coursework than what they would just get if they were a new graduate. But that's not to say that, any occupational therapist would be a good starting point. They would perhaps be able to identify these problems, but then could hopefully link you to referrals where, you might get more intensive intervention or, something specific to the needs of the child. So.
Quick
One more question?
question,
Okay.
but it seems like the same questions kind of keep coming up here in this room, and I was just wondering, if the field is taking on that, dissemination of information, how can you get this information out to people better, and, the process, basically.
Yeah, how people are being educated about sensory processing and sensory integration. yeah, a few things like this, I think. And, you know, the website I gave you, the Sensory Processing Disorder Network, there's a lot of links to information. There's been conferences. So I think what happens is like children who are getting therapy in clinics, they might hear of these kinds of conferences through, you know, a clinical network or a parent network. You know, I'd have to do some more, you know, searching actually to see if there's like a good place to go to you know, other than the resources I've given you and other than some, you know, reading to actually get, you know, an assessment or intervention. How that,
Steps that.
Those are, they're good questions. Yeah, I didn't expect to be asked some of those, you know, very practical link me or resource questions. So, you know, I have that information, but it's just not something that I have available right here.
We're all
So
going to
I'm
make an appointment with you, so.
Well, we can load some of the documents on the website.
Sure.
Too.
Yeah. But, you know, the books, some of the books I have up there, they're really good resources, and they'll give you some ideas, I think, some ideas to try and directions to go. Okay, well, thank you very much.